On both days of Rosh Hashanah, we recite a piyut Melech Elyon. On the first day, it's a piyut that was composed by Rebbe Lazar HaKolir, and on the second day, by Reb Shimon Bar Yitzchak. However, as we analyze it closely, we notice a lot of interesting oddities about both of these piyutim, which forces us to look back at earlier prints and manuscripts to try to figure out what happened to these two piyutim. But that's not all. That itself is going to lead us to Yom Kippur, where we look at the piyutim known as Maisa Elokeinu, one that we recite at Shachris and one that we recite at Musaf. And here too, we're going to find very interesting oddities, the way these are structured, and that's going to lead us to a very interesting discussion about what happened, when did it happen, and why did this happen. On the second day of Rosh Hashanah, for Shachris, in Chazoras Hashatz, after the bracha of Mechaya Amesim, before Kedusha, we say a number of piyutim. And one of the piyutim is known as Melech Elyon. And I'm going to ask a few questions about the structure of this composition. But before we ask those questions, let us get a little bit of a feel for the nature, the tone, and the content of this particular piyut. It reads as follows. It begins, Melech Elyon, exalted king. And then it says, Amitz HaMenusa, the lofty, mighty one. L'chol Rosh Misnase, supreme over all rulers. Oimer va'oisa, who says and does. Ma'oizu Machzor, a fortress and shelter. Nisa v'noise, sublime and uplifting. Moishiv Malachim Lakise, who seats kings upon the throne. And then we conclude saying, Laud ad Yimloich, he will reign forever and ever. Beautiful words said on Rosh Hashanah about the Eibishter. Before we ask the questions, let's read one more stanza. Gibor bigvuros, mighty in every kind of might. Koire hadoiros, who summons the generations into existence, each in its time. Goyle nistaros, revealing hidden things. Imroisav tahoiros, whose words are pure. Yoideas furos, who knows the number of the stars. Lisaitsois mazoros, bringing them forth in their orbit. Laad yimloich, he will reign forever and ever. This gives us a little bit of a feel for what this piyut is all about. But now let's look closely at the structure of this piyut, and we notice something very unusual. There are many of these compositions that we say on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and for that matter, other times of the year as well, and we're used to the idea of them going in the order of the Aleph base, from Aleph through Taf. In fact, in Tanakh itself, you have a number of chapters, number of Kapitlach Tehillim, some chapters in Eicha, that go in the order of the Aleph base. Likewise, we're also used to the idea of a composer putting his name, embedding his name as an acronym in the piyut that he wrote. We're also used to seeing tashrak, and that is going backwards from taf to shin to reish to kuf. This also happens on some occasions. But what happens here is highly unusual. The first paragraph, the first stanza, is an aleph paragraph, amitz hamenusa, but the second paragraph, rather than being a beis, is a gimel, gibor bigvuros. And then the third paragraph, rather than being a dalid, is a hey, hamefoyor b'fi choil. And then it skips the vav and it goes to the zayin. In other words, the even letters, the beis, the dalid, the vav, are missing. You only have here an aleph, a gimel, a hey, and a zayin, and this is how it remains throughout the entire piyut. We have a samach, we have a pei, we have a kuf, we have a shin, and then we come to the end of the piyut. There is no taf, there is a double shin. After shin, we get a double shin. We'll come back to the reason for the double shin in a moment. But before we get to the second shin, we then have something very interesting. The minig is, we close the Aron Kodesh, and we say other words. What are the other words? We say Melech Evyoin, which sounds very similar to Melech Elyoin, but it's Melech Evyoin. Evyoin means impoverished. So the translation that I'm looking at says mortal king, a mortal king, an impoverished king, a destitute king. Okay. And then we have two lines over here talking about a king of flesh and blood, a human king, and all of his disadvantages. Bala virad shachas, he decays and descends to the grave. And it gives a few additional lines over there. And then we say Melech Evyoin again, and it says Tanuma te'ufenu, sleep makes dark for him, Tardema ta'ifefenu. And here the obvious question is, the entire composition is Melech Elyoin. It's all about the Eibishter. Why do we pause? And in a second we're going to mention again, Avol Melech Elyoin, we're going to mention again the Eibishter. Why do we pause over here to talk about a human king? It seems to just come out of left field, being completely irrelevant to the overall structure of this piyut, of this composition. Now, the truth is, when we look closer at this Melech Evyon, we can ask additional questions. Firstly, it's interesting that we read it in an undertone. The undertone itself implies that it doesn't belong. So if it doesn't belong, why is it there? But in addition, when we look a little closer, we'll notice that the entire piyut, this Melech Elyoin, of Chazaras Hashat, of Yoim Beis, of Shachris, of Rosh Hashanah, each stanza has 6 beats. So let's give an example by going to Ois Tes. Tahir Bizvulav, that's 1. Ois Hu Be'er Elav, that's 2. And notice how they all rhyme. Ein Aroich Elav, that's 3. Lifel Kimifalav, that's 4. Chel Sam Givulav, that's 5. Ka'amois Yom Legalav, that's 6. Not counting the Melech Elyoin and the Laud Ad Yumloich. So there's 6 beats. When a person writes a piyut, when a python writes a piyut, one of the things that they're looking for is balance. Balance is a very important part of writing a piyut. You can have balance in terms of how many words and how many phrases and how many lines. And here we see the focus on 6 beats with the of sound at the end of each one, in this particular one in the test, to make the beautiful piyut that we were able to read today. Here's the problem. The problem is when we go to the Melech Evyoin over here, which I said seems like it's coming from left field, we count the number of beats, and there's a different number. The whole piyut all has 6 beats, but the Melech Evyoin has Bala Verod Shachas, 1, Bishoilu V'Sachas, 2, Bleos Blinachas, 3. And then it concludes saying Ad Masa Yimloich. Instead of by the Eibishter, by God, we say Laud Ad Yimloich, will reign forever. By a human king, we say Ad Masa Yimloich, how long already? How long will he already be able to be king? But why do we transition from 6 beats to 3 beats? In addition, there's another point here. In the bays, the first Melech Evyoin, we notice each beat begins with a bays. Bala Verod Shachas, Bishoilu V'Sachas, Beleos Blinachas, 3 bases. And likewise, the next Melech Evyoin is 3 tofs. Tenuma Te'ufenu, Tardema Ta'ifefenu, Tayu Yushefenu, 3. 3 tofs, 3 bases. Why is that unusual? Because throughout the structure of this entire piyut, we never had 3 of the same letter. For going back to Aleph, Ametz Hamenusa L'chorosh Misnase. Ametz Hamenusa, that's 1 Aleph. L'chorosh Misnase doesn't begin with an Aleph. Oimer V'oisa does, so that's 2. But Moiz U'Machza doesn't. Nisa V'noisa doesn't. So if you look closely at this piyut, each one begins with the appropriate letter, the Aleph, the Gimel, the Hey, the Zayin, etc. Maybe there'll be one other one, but you'll never have 3, never have all of them. And here all of a sudden we see the Python is attempting that each beat should begin with the same letter, which is not something that happens throughout the entirety of the piyut. And so therefore, these are very odd realities about this piyut, and it requires some iyun, some investigation about what happened over here. Now the truth is, let's address the fact that the shin doubles up over here. There's a reason the shin doubles up. This final stanza is where the Python embeds his name. This is also very common. There's different ways of putting your name in, but one of the ways is, especially if you did a piyut that goes in the order of the Aleph Beis, or at least here in the semi-Aleph Beis, you can use the last stanza to embed your name at the beginning of each beat. And that's what happens over here. Because it says shoifet to emes, that's a shin. Ma'bodo v'emes, that's a men. Then it's oiseh chesed v'emes, that's the ayin. V'rav chesed v'emes, that's the vav. Nisivosoi emes, that is the nun. So that spells the name Shimon. And then it says choisamoi emes, that's a ches. And ches stands for chazak. And we know during the Middle Ages, just like we use the term sheyichya today, he should live, then it was very common to use the term chazak, he should be well. This spells the name Shimon. Who are we talking about? The name Shimon we actually see a lot on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. Many of the piyutim of the second day of Rosh Hashanah was written by a man named Reb Shimon ben Yitzchak. Sometimes he's called Reb Shimon ben Yitzchak HaGadol. He lived in the 900s in Mainz in Germany. He was a chaver Rabbeinu Gershom Meir HaGoyla, a very noted python. Many of the piyutim that we say on the second day of Rosh Hashanah come from him, and he usually puts his name there, and that's what's happening here, which explains why we get a double shin. The double shin is there for the python to give us his name. Great. So we know who wrote this piyut. We're also able to know around when it was written, but the underlying questions still remain. And let us now turn to the first day of Rosh Hashanah, to the Chazaras Hashatz of Yom Aleph, Musaf. We're right before Unesane Toikif. We say another Melech Elyoin piyut, but when we look closely, we see that the wording here is actually different. The assumption is that this piyut that we say on the first day in Musaf, this Melech Elyoin, was written by Rebbe Lazar HaKolir, who is considerably earlier than Reb Shimon. Rebbe Lazar HaKolir lived in Eretz Yisrael, and in terms of his dating, we discussed it last year in the Shir on the Machzor, so we're not going to go back there today. Let's read it, and then we'll ask some questions. So after the opening words, the chorus, Melech Elyoin, it says, Keil Dar B'Amorim, exalted Almighty God who dwells on high, Adir B'Amorim, who is mighty on high, Oimetz Yodei Tarum, the power of his hand shall be lifted high, and it concludes with another chorus, La'adei Ad Yimloich, he will reign forever and ever. So the opening and the closing of each stanza is the same. The Melech Elyoin at the beginning, the La'adei Ad Yimloich at the end, but the words in the middle are different. Okay. So Rabbi Lazar HaKolir wrote his Melech Elyoin that we say on the first day of Rosh Hashanah in Musaf. Reb Shimon Bar Yitzchak wrote his Melech Elyoin, which we say on the second day of Rosh Hashanah in Shachris. But the same question that we asked before on the Shachris piyut, we're going to ask here as well. Because when we look well here, we notice that the first stanza opens with the word Keil, which is an Aleph. The next stanza skips the Beis, and it goes straight to Gibur Lahakim. The next one, Hamedaber Bitstaka Ohei. The next one, Zeicher Tzurim Azayin. Skipping every other letter till we come toward the end. This again is highly unusual. We do not see this in piyutim. We see many other structures, as I elaborated before, but we do not see skipping Aleph Beis like this. And then, similar to the way it's done in Shachris on the second day here as well, we close the Aron and quietly we say Melech Evyoin. And the same question we ask there, we'll ask here. How does Melech Evyoin, talking about a mortal king, how does that fit into this piyut, which is all about the Eibishter? It seems to be irrelevant. And that's probably why we say it in a whisper. If we say it in a whisper, then maybe don't say it at all. But in terms of the other questions we asked over there, in terms of the number of beats, that question actually does not pertain here. Because in this piyut, Rabbi Lazar HaKolir's Melech Elyoin, there is in fact for each stanza only 3 beats. So for example, if we go to Aleph, Kel Dar B'Amorim 1, Adir B'Amorim 2, Oimetz Yodei Tarum 3. And so when we come to the Melech Evyoin at the end, and there is only 3 beats, which we read before, that makes a lot of sense. 3 beats. That actually fits. What's also beautiful about this is that Rabbi Lazar HaKolir in his piyut, each stanza has the same letter 3 times. There are 3 alephs for aleph, there's 3 gimels for the gimel, there's 3 heys for the hey. So it makes a lot of sense in the Melech Evyoin that there's 3 bases for the first line and there's 3 tufs for the last line. So while it was odd in Reb Shimon's piyut, it seems to fit well here. Okay, so those questions pertain to Reb Shimon and do not pertain here. But now that invites another question. And that is, if 2 Gedolei Yisrael wrote 2 different piyutim and they only shared the Melech Elyoin and the La'adei Ad Yimloich, but all the other words are the same. So what happened over here that suddenly they're both using the same one? I guess the question would be stronger, you would say, on Reb Shimon. Why would you put in everything you created new, but for the 2 lines of Melech Evyoin, all of a sudden you forgot how to be original and you decided that you dafka have to use the 2 lines for Rabbi Lazar HaKolir? What's going on over here? So these are some questions, some obvious questions that any close read of these 2 piyutim the Melech Elyon piyutim, they lead to these questions. So the first thing we do when we have such questions is we say, well, let's go back to earlier printings and let's see if anything is different than earlier printings. So we're turning back now to a Machzor that was printed in Lublin in the year 1551. That's within the first century of printing in Poland. And we're looking here at Reb Shimon's second day Melech Elyon, and we see that more or less it's exactly the same the way it appears in our Machzor today. It's missing every other letter. It has the 2 lines of Melech Elyon at the end. And so no, this is not a change that has been introduced in the Machzor recently. What we have in the year 2024 in our Machzor is pretty much the same thing they had in Lublin in the year 1551. And the same thing when we turn to Musaf of the first day, we find that what we have today is pretty much the same thing we had back then. And so no, this is not a recent phenomenon. This is quite an old phenomenon. And in fact, it was noticed by one of the Gdolei Yisrael. One of the Gdolei Yisrael noticed this. His name was Reb Moshe. He wrote the Sefer Mata Moshe. He was a student of the Maharshal. So his rough dates are the second half of the 16th century. In other words, he was around when this Machzor in Lublin was printed, 1551. He was born around that time. Maybe there's even a chance that he saw this Machzor that we're looking at right here, or at least something similar to this. Anyway, he printed a sefer, a halacha sefer called Mata Moshe, which was published in Krakow in the year 1591. And he writes as follows, about the first day Musaf. We open the Aron Kodesh when we do the piyut Melech Elyon. Now about this piyut, he writes, V'hu chatzi alfa besa. This piyut has half of the aleph base. Why does it have only half? He's noticing what we notice. Because it was structured in such a way that the aleph is for Hashem, the Melech Elyon. But then the beis was supposed to be for the Melech Elyon, to talk about a human impoverished king. And then it was supposed to go back, the gimel is for the Melech Elyon. And v'chein kulam, it's supposed to go back and forth. In other words, the Mata Moshe is saying that the original composition of this piyut was a back and forth between the Melech Elyon and the Melech Elyon. I was saying before that the theme is all Melech Elyon about Hashem. And I was asking, how does a Melech Elyon, why are we sneaking it in at the end? Well, according to the Mata Moshe, the theme wasn't Melech Elyon alone. It wasn't only about Hashem. The very structure of this piyut originally was Melech Elyon Aleph. Let's compare it to Melech Elyon, a human king, in Beis. Melech Elyon Gimel, let's compare it to a Melech Elyon in Dalet. And etc., going through all of the Aleph base. He continues and says, Va'anu, however, our minig is that Ein Oimrim Shul Melech Elyon. We cut out the Melech Elyons. We don't say the Melech Elyon, Rak HaRishon Va'achrim. We only do the first and the last. Indeed, the first one over there is a Beis, and the last one is a Taf. Right? Bala verod shachas and tenuma teufenu, or something like that. So we do the beis and the taf. Melech Elyon bala verod shachas, he continues saying, and Melech Elyon tenuma teufenu. That's what we do. But this is a vestige of many more for all the other missing letters. And so this is a very interesting theory that the Mata Moshe presents in his sefer, which was again published in the late 1500s. He doesn't tell us how he knows this. He doesn't say where he saw it. And so what we need to do is we actually need to investigate and look back earlier to see, is there any evidence for the hypothesis of the Mata Moshe, which we will do in a moment. But before we do that, he makes a discovery based on this, and this could be the reason why he was saying all of this, is because there's a mistake in his day that bothered him based on this hypothesis of his. What's the mistake? If you go back to this Machzor from 1551 Lublin, and you look closely at the Melech Evyons, the 2 Melech Evyons, you'll notice it does not say Bale Verod Shachas. It actually says the word Kole. So Kole means to dissolve, to be eliminated. Bala means to be worn out. So these words are actually similar in the sense of getting rid of something or decaying, but ultimately it's 2 different words. One is bala, which means to be worn out, and kala, which means to knock out and to eliminate. Many of the Machzorim printed, at least in Poland in this era, and we're looking here at Lublin 1551, take say kole v'rod shachas. But it can't be, says the Mata Moshe, because we know that really this is a baseline, and it needs to have 3 bases. And just like the aleph of a Lazar HaKolir's piyut has 3 alephs. And once you know that this is not just a random line, but it's actually the baseline, then you know it's not kole v'rod shachas, it's bole v'rod shachas. And so he says we need to correct this error. Indeed, Machzor printed today all say bole v'rod shachas, do not have this error. But I checked 2 or 3 Machzorim printed in Poland in this era, the last half of the second half of the 16th century. And indeed we find over there a few, I think I saw 3 examples, including the one we're looking at right here, where they used the kaf. Fine. So why was he able to say this? Only because he figured out that these 2 lines here are not random lines, they're actually the bays and the tuf, and once upon a time there were many more letters that were here. Okay, so we have a theory, we have an hypothesis. Let us go and let us check it out. Is this the case in the manuscripts? Baruch Hashem, we have a nice number of Machzor manuscripts, and much of it today is available online, so we're actually able to read them and see what we have. So right now we're looking at a Machzor that's in the Bodleian library in Oxford. It's known as manuscript Michael 619. It's dated to the year to the early 1300s. That's the dating that the website gives us for this Machzor. We're looking at the second day's Melech Elyon, meaning Reb Shimon's Melech Elyon, and we have it. But we have it exactly the way we have it, in the sense that there's no Beis here, and there's no Dalid, and there's no Hey, there's no Melech Evyons. There's no Melech Evyons. What Reb Moshe said is the case. We don't see any evidence of this in this Machzor here, in this Machzor from the 1300s, Michael 619. In fact, it only gets worse, and it becomes more mysterious, because when we look back here, even at the end, between the 2 shins, there are no Melech Evyons. Those 2 lines, Melech Evyon, do not exist at all in this manuscript. And this is not the only one. Many of the Ashkenazi Machzorim that come to us from the 1200s and from the 1300s and from the 1400s, many of them are exactly like this. The Melech Elyon piyut with 0 Melech Evyon, not even the 2 at the end. So as of now, it's not looking too good for Reb Moshe, the author of the Sefer Mata Moshe. In this same Machzor, in Michael 619, if you turn to Musaf of the first day, Rebbe Lazar HaKolir's Melech Elyon, same thing. We have the Aleph, we're missing the Beis. We have the Gimel, we're missing the Daled, and there is no Melech Evyon at all, not even the 2 at the end. And as I said, this is true for many other manuscripts of this during this period. Now, what's interesting is this Machzor 619 that we're looking at right now. We notice in earlier pages there's a commentary written alongside the Machzor. This is interesting. In addition to being a beautiful Machzor, beautiful calligraphy, this particular one, this doesn't always happen. In fact, I think it's less likely for this to happen, where a commentary on the Machzor is presented on the outside margins of the page. What's interesting is, when we come to Melech Elyon, the commentary ceases to exist. There is no, for Rebbe Lazar HaKolir's Melech Elyon, there is no commentary, which makes it look very odd on the page, because the space for the commentary was reserved, but no commentary has been executed. They're making this page stand out from all other pages. Why is that? So when we look, actually, if we zoom in into this commentary right at Melech Elyon, we find that it says Melech Elyon, Keol Dar Morim, mamish on the bottom left at the beginning of Rebbe Lazar HaKolir's first day Melech Elyon, it says Loi Isparish, which means it has not been explained. So what does this mean? What does he mean here when he says Loi Isparish? This commentary that's presented in this Machzor is a known commentary that exists in multiple manuscripts from medieval Ashkenaz. In other words, we don't know exactly who wrote it, but it was written early on, whether it's in the late 900s or the early 1000s, someone writes a commentary. And it's then presented in multiple manuscripts where it gets copied. And there are small variations between them. And I've looked at a few of these manuscripts that have this commentary. And when it comes to Melech Elyon, they have nothing to say. So this scribe over here, who is coming to write the commentary. Presumably, he writes the commentary after the person wrote the calligraphy. And the person wrote the regular nusach of the Machzor, left space in the margins for the commentary. Now he knows the commentary writer is like, 1 second, I have nothing to write here because there's nothing in these other manuscripts, and on common there's nothing here. But on the other hand, there's so much space, so I can't say nothing, so I have no choice but to write. And he wrote, Melech Elyon Kel Dar Morim, that's the Dibur HaMaschil, and he writes, Lo Yasparesh, this has not been explained. Which, now we need to ask the question, why is it, Taka, that this piyut was not, why would there be commentary on every other piece of Machzor, but not this one? It almost lends itself to an argument that for the people writing this commentary, or the person writing this commentary way back when, he wasn't reciting Melech Elyon. He wasn't saying it at all. And therefore he didn't explain it, which raises a question. It was definitely written before, these piyutim were written before this commentary was written. The commentary is, so why would you not be saying these piyutim? So we're only adding this to the bag of questions about this. Now, as of now, the Mata Moshe's theory has not been borne out by looking at one manuscript, but really there's many manuscripts that don't confirm it. However, he was absolutely right. Reb Moshe, the author of the Mata Moshe, was absolutely right. And we're going to turn now to a manuscript from the Cairo Geniza. And very often the Cairo Geniza becomes helpful to solving problems, and in this case as well, very helpful in solving this particular enigma. We're looking here at the davening of Rosh Hashanah. You see on the right-hand page is Lekel Oirich Din. Now obviously this is not a work of art. This is the Cairo Geniza. This Machzor is not something that a wealthy patron commissioned. This is a regular Machzor that a regular Jew went to someone and said, it's before printing obviously, I need a Machzor for Rosh Hashanah, can you please write up something rudimentary and basic? And that's what it is. And in a sense, maybe when we look at this, we get more of a feeling for what the average Jew would have been looking at if he was Zoichet to have a Machzor for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening. And what do we have? We have on the right hand side, Uvechein Ulecha Hakol Yachtiru, we have the piyut Lekel Oirich Din. After that we have the Melech Elyon piyut. It doesn't say Melech Elyon, it says Mem Ayin, and there's a dot over each. There's a dot over the Mem, there's a dot over the Ayin. That's the scribal way of saying this is a Rosh Tevis. So Mem Ayin stands for Melech Elyon. And then we have the line of Rebbe Lazar HaKolier's first day Musaf piyut Kel Dar Morim Adar Ba Morim, and it's right there. Ladei Ad Yimlech. Beautiful. And then right there under is Mem Aleph, each with a dot over it, Mem Aleph, Melech Evyoin, and indeed we have Balev, Verod, Shachas, not all the way at the end, buried at the end, right under the Aleph we have the Beis line. Then it goes to Melech Elyon, Gibar Lahakim, which is what we have in our Machzor today. And then after the Gibar Lahakim line, there's Mem Aleph, Melech Elyon, and it gives us a Dalid describing the impoverished, destitute human king using Dalit. And likewise, all the way throughout, it gives us, after each Melech Elyon, it is a Melech Evyon. It gives us a Mem Aleph, and what this piyut is essentially doing is it's saying, let's talk about how great God is on the one hand, and then let's compare it to a human king and how limited a human king is, and that's supposed to bring a person to a certain feeling. The feeling is what we call Gadlos Hakel v'Shiflos Adam. By referencing the greatness of Hashem, but also the lowliness of man, and in this particular case, lowliness of a certain type of person, the human king. And then this is something Chazal do all the time. They say, unlike a Melech Basar Adam, the Eibishter behaves differently. And that's what this piyut is essentially doing. It's taking the human king, something that human beings normally honor and are scared of and are impressed by, and it says, however impressed you are by this, let's remember, he's a Melech Evyon. And ultimately, there's a Melech Elyon who is so much more supreme. And it goes back and forth all the way through to the end. Melech Elyon and Melech Evyon. I should point out, the Tuf, however, is not the Tuf that we have. It's a different line. It's not the Tnuma to Ufenu. It's a different line of Tuf, but we're not going to get into that today. Now, the truth is that beside for the Cairo Geniza, we have one manuscript that I'm familiar with that comes from Europe that actually preserves this tradition that preserves this original formulation of the piyut the way Rebbe Elazar HaKolir wrote it. I should point out that it's not surprising to have in the Cairo Geniza a piyut Rebbe Elazar HaKolir. Remember, he's operating in Eretz Yisrael, so he definitely has an influence in the region, including Mitzrayim, so it makes a lot of sense that some of the material, that his piyutim would end up in the Cairo Geniza. But back to Europe, in the National Library of France is a document, Hebrew 631, which is a Machzor manuscript from the year 1453, so it's relatively speaking late in the game, from the city of Avignon. Avignon is in the general area of Provence, and although in 1453 Jews had already been expelled from France during the 14th century, 3 or 4 times they were expelled from France, but that did not apply to Avignon, which was a papal dominion, and Jews were allowed to stay there all the way throughout. And this Machzor comes from this community of Avignon. And they have their own nusach. You cannot classify it as falling into the category of Ashkenaz. Even within Ashkenaz, there's a difference between the French, and there's a difference between the Western Ashkenaz, and there's a difference between the Eastern Ashkenaz. So definitely going down south to Avignon is its own nusach, but there's definitely some Ashkenazi influence here. And there's also Rebbe Elazar HaKolir influence. Just like Rebbe Elazar HaKolir has influence in Ashkenaz, he has influence here as well. And on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, they have this piyut of Melech Elyon here, Rebbe Elazar HaKolir's, and it has the full Aleph Beis, bouncing back between the Melech Elyon to the Melech Evyon. And here, by the way, the Tuf is actually the Tuf that we have. Tnuma te'ufenu, Tardema te'ifefenu, toyu yishefenu, ad mosai yimloich. That's the difference. For the human king, it's ad mosai yimloich. For the divine king, it's la dea yimloich. He will be a king forever. And so it turns out that the Mata Moshe is absolutely correct. At least when it comes to Rebbe Elazar HaKolir's original composition, we did have a full Aleph Beis bouncing back between an Elyon and an Evyon, and that's great. Now, before we continue, let's pause and notice something interesting about this manuscript. It has a colophon at the end, which is why I was able to say that it's from Avignon in the year 1453. What happens here is that at the end, the last page of this manuscript, the Nagdan, the person who was tasked with writing out the Nikud, remember when you're doing a manuscript, there could be multiple jobs. There's the person who does the basic nosach, the calligraphy. If there's going to be a commentary, that's probably going to be very possibly by somebody else. If there is a nekudos, then that's going to be written by someone else. And if there's going to be art, that's also going to be done by someone else. Of course, theoretically, someone could do it all together. But here it happens to be that the Nagdan is an individual, and this is what he writes. He says, "My name is Vidal Moshe. I live here in Avignon. I did the nekudos for this siddur that belongs to the Kehila of Avignon." Remember, these larger Machzorim are not usually individually owned. Very often, it's the Kehila that owns it. The Kehila has the funds to be able to have it, and they probably give it to the Chazan to use, while not necessarily every person in the shul, before the advent of the printing press, would have had the privilege of having a Machzor, and even if, not necessarily would have been a beautiful one. Anyway, he goes on to say, so I did the nekudos, but I didn't do the nekudos based on my own knowledge. I'm not wise enough and I don't know diktuk. So what did I do? I basically just copied what I saw. That's really interesting because there have been times we've looked at various passages and questioned some of the diktuk and some of the nekutos, where here he's testifying himself that he isn't the biggest expert. He goes on to say that I finished this job, and get ready, this is a wonderful line. When did he finish preparing this Machzor? B'yom Tisha ve'esrim l'chodesh Elul, on the 29th of Elul. I love that. By the buzzer. If not for the last second, nothing gets done. The 29th of Elul is when he finishes the nekudos for this Machzor, and then he gives the year in the Hebrew, which comes out to the year 1453. He then goes on to say something very interesting, and we only know this information because of this colophon in this single manuscript. He says that that year in the city of Arles is in the area of Avignon, but further south, he says there was a blood libel. The non-Jews, Samu Alilois Dvarim, Shem Shoichatei Hayalodim, that they slaughtered Christian children, umidamam oisim charoises, and that they use it for charoises. We're used to hearing the matzah claim. Here we see the charoises claim. And he goes on to say that an investigation was done, but the king and the investigators cleared the Jews, and this was a big simcha by the Jewish community there, and it's so important for him, he decided to write this in to his caliphate. Anyway, so what the Mata Moshe has suggested is borne out, not by many of the manuscripts that we have surviving in Europe, but by two unique manuscripts for the Musaf Melech Elyon. Number one, we saw the Geniza. Number two, we saw this unique manuscript from Avignon. What about the second day's Shachris, Reb Shimon's Melech Elyon? Here is the same thing true here. So the Mata Moshe actually didn't address it head on. He didn't say anything on this question. But it turns out that the same thing he says applied there applies here as well, which makes a lot of sense. Because if you're Reb Shimon, and you obviously are trying to emulate Rebbe Lazar HaKolir, using the same theme that of Melech Elyon and Laud Ad Yimloich, and now we know also Melech Evyon and Ad Masa Yimloich. So if you're trying to create something for the second day to be recited, you're probably going to follow, and you follow the same pattern in terms of the Melech Elyon and the Melech and the Laud Ad Yimloich, and you're going in alphabetical order, it stands to reason that you would have also done the Melech Evyon in the exact same way. And there is this one manuscript, Bodleian Library, Laud, Oriental, number 321. And when we look at the second day piyut, the Melech Elyon, Reb Shimon's piyut, we actually find that tucked neatly under each Melech Elyon, there is indeed a Melech Evyon line. Not the same one as Kolir. Just like Reb Shimon wrote new Melech Elyon material, he wrote new material for God in his Aleph, he wrote new material for the human king in his Beis. And this is true for all of them, going all the way through Tuf. They're all unique. Beis through Tuf. Every Melech Evyon is unique. Let's actually read some of them to get a feel for Reb Shimon's Melech Evyon. Here's the Beis. Bazoi umeshuse. The human king is despised and plundered. Pisha'av mechase. His sins he buries. Bahul umusise. He's confused and weak. V'avoin poise. His transgressions grow. Nivchan maase. His deeds are scrutinized. V'oitzara yishase. And his treasure is plundered. And instead of ad masa yimloich, he concludes ve'ech yimloich. How then shall he reign? Which is like more of undermining the king. Like, how can you even be king given all of these limitations that you have? Let's do the Melech Evyon in the Rosh. Rachamav shechusim. His compassion is corrupt. Midoisav pechusim. His traits are base. Drachav chasachtim. His ways are treacherous. Psha'av charusim. His sins are engraved. Yuval lam misim. He is led to the dead. Kivkore defasim. Like barn cattle. Ve'ech yimloich. How then shall he reign? And the Tuf is not the same Tuf. His Tuf is not the same Tuf like Elazar HaKolir's Tuf. His Tuf is Toichalta Navoicha. His hope is confounded. Tikvasai Ne'elava. His aspiration is shameful. Gviyasai Nirkeva. His body is weakened. Nishmasai Nichava. His soul is pain. Nishbar v'nishba. Broken and captured. Milahat hayoim haba. By the coming day's heat. I guess that's a reference to Gehenim or something like that. Ve'ech yimloich. How then shall he reign? You'll notice over here, 6 beats. All the Melech Evyons are 6 beats, which makes a lot of sense because the Melech Elyon is 6 beats. The Melech Evyon is also going to be 6 beats. You'll also notice that there isn't 3 in these passages that begin with the same initial letter. 1 or 2, but not 3, because Rebbe Elazar HaKolir did 3 beats, each starting with the same initial letter. Reb Shimon bar Rabbi Yitzchak did not. He had his own style. So let's summarize what we found so far. Rabbi Elazar HaKolir wrote a full 3-beat Melech Elyon, Melech Evyon, changing back and forth piyut. The Melech Evyon concluded with the words Ad Masai Yimloich. Reb Shimon bar Yitzchak, writing later, wrote a full 6-beat Melech Elyon, Melech Evyon piyut. The Melech Evyon concluded with the words Ve'ech Yimloich. Now, some disruption must have happened over here. And this is a disruption that happened early on. Because remember I said before, when we look at 13th and 14th century Machzor, most of them have no Melech Evyons for either one of these piyutim. The most extreme seems to be not giving it any commentary. The fact that the commentator did not write any pirush on this piyut seems to imply, at least as a possibility, that the piyut wasn't recited. That would be one expression of this disruption. Another expression of this disruption, less extreme, is just keeping the Melech Elyon, removing all of the Melech Evyon stanzas, which is what we saw in one Machzor, Michael 6:19, which represented many more. A middle ground we saw is to have font indicating in a smaller font. We saw this just for Reb Shimon's second day piyut. Having font, I didn't stress this before, I'll stress it now, that when we were looking at all of those Melech Evyons in the Laud manuscript, each one of them did not have nekudos, unlike the rest of the piyut, and was in a smaller font. That indicates that it probably wasn't normative. Many people didn't say it, or those who did say it said it quietly. So these are different ways of expressing this disruption. Now, we obviously have to address the question of why is this happening? What is the event that causes this to happen? If both piyutim were written in this extensive way, why this change? What led to all of this? But before we get to addressing those particular questions, or this particular question, let's remember the following. In our Machzor, we have a different way of doing this. Yes, we removed most of the Melech Evyons, but we retained two. We retained the Beis, and we retained the Taf, and we pushed it to the end of the piyut. Is there any evidence that this behavior was present in the manuscript age? So the answer is yes. We do have this in the manuscript age as well. So if we go to Bodleian Library, manuscript Laud 321, if we look at Rabbi Elazar HaKolir's first day Musaf, Melech Elyon, we find something close. Not the same, but something close. And that is, you only have Melech Elyons throughout, but then when you come all the way to the end, after a shin, before you say the tuf for Melech Elyon, you have a tuf for Melech Evyon. One line of tuf. Tnuma to ufana line is squeezed in. So not the Beis, but at least you do have that concept of the tuf buried here. And we have the same thing for Reb Shimon's. If we go to Bodleian Library, Michael 627, this is Reb Shimon's second day Shachris Melech Elyon. Again, no Evyons here. But when we come to the last one, right before we get to his name, remember his name was in Shoifet HaEmes, Ma'abad of Emes. Right before that, squeezed in is one Melech Evyon, again, just the tuf. But here's the important thing. It's not Elazar HaKolir's tuf. It is a 6-beat Reb Shimon's tuf, the one with the words Teichalta Nevucha, which we spoke about before. So this custom that we have today of saying just a little bit of the Evyon, and at the end, yes, we had it. But what's different here is two things. Only the tuf, not the Beis. I don't know where that custom started of doing the first and the last. That's something for another time. But additionally, when this was being done, each got its own. Reb Shimon's had Reb Shimon's tuf, and Rabbi Elazar HaKolir had Rabbi Elazar HaKolir's tuf. That's what we see in these manuscripts. What seems to have, and that makes more sense, obviously, to leave the original the way it was. What seems to have happened is that for reasons that are not clear to me, number one, instead of just doing the tuf, we also did the Beis. Okay, that's fine. But what's a little less clear, because this is a little more controversial, is rather than using each to their own, somehow Rabbi Elazar HaKolir's Melech Evyon snuck its way in to Reb Shimon's Melech Elyon piyut for reasons that A, I don't fully understand why that happened, and B, I don't know when or why that happened. And again, closer investigations into those details are going to be for another time. So now let's address the big question. The big question is, why the disruption? However the disruption is, and we've had 4 different expressions of the possible disruption. Again, just to summarize. 1, not saying at all, the whole piyut. Number 2, removing all the Melech Evyons. Number 3, the smaller font of all the Melech Evyons, indicating that perhaps they were recited quietly. And number 4 is only saying one or two melech evyoins, and here too, when they do exist in these medieval manuscripts, in these two examples, they're in a smaller font, indicating that they would have been said quietly. Why this disruption? So there's the Koran Machzor that was put out a number of years ago with the commentary by Rabbi Sachs. So if we go to page 561, we see that he addresses this issue, what the original piyut used to be and what it is now, and says as follows. Evidently, this was considered disrespectful of the rulers of the countries in which Jews lived. What he's saying is, having a piyut that talks about the limitations, and perhaps even in some cases the corruption of the human king, was disrespectful of the rulers where Jews lived. And it was contrary to the principle of Heve Mispalo B'Shleimish HaMalchus. Heve Mispalo B'Shleimish HaMalchus means we talk good about the government, not to denigrate it. And so that's a reason why the disruption happened in any of the expressions that we spoke about before. This is what he says for the first day's Musaf. When it comes to the second day's Shacharis, actually I don't remember, it's for one of them. That's page 561. When it comes to the other piyut, which is on page 693, he writes along the same lines, but with a little bit of a different argument, and it's not entirely clear why he would have written it differently in these two situations. Here he says, it is not clear why the poem was edited in this way. It may have felt, it looks like there's a typo here, it may have felt dangerous, even Lei's majesty, which is Merida b'Malchus, for Jews to denigrate the grandeur of human kings, especially when their very permission to live in a country depended on the will, sometimes the whim, of the king. So here, in the earlier passage, he focuses on it's disrespectful and it goes against what it says in Pirkei Avos. Now he's saying it's unsafe. Okay, both of these could be true, but I'm not sure why he would focus more in each of these ways, but that's not our concern right now. This is Rabbi Sachs's idea of what happened over here. Now the emes is, he is not the first to suggest this. In fact, there's a sefer, a very, very popular sefer called Tameh HaMinhagim, which was printed in the late 1800s by a rabbi named Avram Yitzchak Sperling in Lemberg, in Lvov. And a very popular sefer, found in many, many homes, gone through many printings. And it says as follows, he quotes the Mata Moshe that we had before. And he says, why? Remember, the Mata Moshe didn't say why we lost many or most of the Melech Evyoins. So he explains, and the reason is Mipnei HaMalchus. Mipnei HaMalchus, he's saying what Rabbi Sachs is saying is because of the government. The government doesn't want to hear us saying the piyut Melech Evyoin. Okay, he then goes on to say the following. You know, what's the common way, nusach, the standard nusach for a very long time has been, that when shuls recite the Melech Elyon piyut, the La de Ad Yimloich HaMelech Elyon almost become one sentence. In fact, in one particular expression of this would be La de Ad Yimloich Melech Elyon. He says, one second, once I know what the Mata Moshe is talking about, and once I know that after La de Ad Yimloich going on the Melech Elyon, there was a pause, and we started talking about a Melech Evyon, and we concluded saying Ad Masai Yimloich or Ve'ech Yimloich, and then only then we went back and said the next Melech Elyon. So obviously there's no connection between La de Ad Yimloich and Melech Elyon. These are two separate things, and in between there used to be a whole passage. So he doesn't like the way the niggin is sung. He thinks it would be better to say La de Ad Yimloich, period, and then restart again Melech Elyon. Okay, the truth is that there are many piyutim where there's this style where there seems to be a not focusing so much on the original intent of the piyut and using the tune in such a way of dragging the end into a beginning, but for whatever reason those didn't bother him. Now that he figured out, the Tameh HaMinhagim did, that there used to be a Melech Evyon here, he doesn't like the way the Kehillas go La de Ad Yimloich Melech Elyon. He thinks there should be a period in between. Okay, interesting. Now the emes is, he himself is not the first one to discuss this theory about the government. We go back to the early 1800s, a man by the name of Wolf Heidenheim. We spoke about him last year in the Shir on the Machzor. And he prints the Machzor. He puts a lot of research and work into this Machzor, into getting the correct nusach, and he wrote notes about his decisions. And under the Melech Elyon of the first day of Rosh Hashanah for Musaf, the Rebbe Lazar HaKolier's, he writes, HaKihilois heisiru kol cheruz Melech Evyon. The communities remove this ba'avor ha'machloikes, because of the machloikes. Now that's a very vague term, but we know from elsewhere in the Machzor, he uses this very clearly in the context of that passage seems to disparage non-Jews, and so therefore not a good idea and not safe for it to be there. And so that's clearly the case there. And so when he uses the term here, he's essentially saying the same thing Tamam and Hagim was saying, and he's saying the same thing that Rabbi Sachs is saying. So we have three different individuals making this point, explaining that this is why the disruption happened to the Melech Elyon Piyut, which would explain why some wouldn't say it at all, or some would take out all the Evyons, or some maybe would have it, but would say it quietly. If the Chazan is saying it quietly, maybe no big deal. Or maybe even to be extra safe, only say one or two lines and say them quietly. This is how these individuals explain what happened here. Now the truth is, if you want, you could build on this theory even more. And that's because of the following. In 1970, there is a Yid in Yerushalayim, or in Eretz Yisrael at least, Daniel Goldschmidt. And he is, in the 20th century, the biggest expert in the Nusach HaTfilah and the Machzorim, and he published works on many of the Yom Tov piyutim and Machzorim for the whole year, including Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And in Tavshan Lamed, he released the version for Rosh Hashanah, and one of the things he did is for both Melech Elyoins, he went back to the manuscripts and he pulled the information that we showed before and in other manuscripts, and he published for the first time the full piyut Melech Elyon followed by Melech Evyon. Okay, in Eretz Yisrael, there's a famous historian named Yitzchak Ber. Yitzchak Ber gets his hands on this new publication, reads it, he's very interested in this, and he writes a letter to Daniel Goldschmidt about this Machzor that he read, thanking him for it. And he says, I found interesting to see for the first time the lines of Melech Evyon in Reb Shimon's piyut, specifically in Reb Shimon's second day Shachris, the 6-beat Melech Evyon piyut, written by Reb Shimon in the 900s. He said, I found that very interesting because he seems to be describing, when he's talking about the Melech Evyon, he seems to be describing, at least in a characteristic way, I'm struggling with the pronunciation of that word, but you get the point. He's describing Otto the First, Otto the Second, and Otto the Third. These are three what were known as the Holy Roman Emperors who were very much present in that region at that time in the late 900s, and they were very into their glory, and they wanted to see themselves as the continuation of the Roman Empire, and they viewed themselves as the Roman emperors, and they had this movement that was called Renovatio Imperii, which is the renewal of the empire. Says Yitzchak Ber, I don't think this is just random that Shimon is writing this about just any king. I actually think that he's writing a piyut describing the king he knows and sees vain and corrupt and comparing them to Hashem. This is what Yitzchak Ber writes to Daniel Goldschmidt in a few lines in a letter dated Chav Gimel El Tov Shin Lamed. Well, if Ber is right, then all the more so does it make the theory by Rabbi Sachs and by the Tamei Aminhagim and by Wolf Heidenheim all the more of a risk and all the more disrespectful. You're not just talking theoretically about a king, which could be something that a king takes offense at. You're in fact directly attacking with words a king, and so all the more so they would be bothered by this. So if Yitzchak Ber is right, then it only would lend more credence to this theory. And so therefore, it seems like we have a very nice explanation for what happened over here. Except for one thing. And now we're going to have to revisit this explanation. Because let's put Rosh Hashanah aside. And let's go to the tefillas of Yom Kippur. And on Yom Kippur, there's a piyut that we say in Shachris that's called Maisa Alekeinu. This piyut was composed in the same era as Reb Shimon. It was composed by Reb Meshulam ben Kleinowitz, lived in the same place in Mainz, Germany, the same time, the late 900s. And he wrote this piyut, who the refrain, the chorus is Maisa Alekeinu. And the first passage is Emi Bashachet Yarachle. We're talking about Hashem over here, and it goes Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Daled. and then we have Maisa Elokeinu, and then it goes Hey, Vav, Zayin, Ches. Then we have Maisa Elokeinu, and then it goes Tes, Yod, all the letters. There's no missing letters here. So on that front, there's no issue here, and there's no comparison between what we have here and the Melech Elyon piyut. However, at the end of this piyut, we close the Aron. And then, instead of saying Maisa Elokeinu, we say Maisa Yanosh. We're talking about human beings. And we rattle off quickly, quietly, one quick line about the limitations of human beings. And then we go back to Maisa Elokeinu. This looks very, very similar to the Melech Elyon situation. And so, now that we learned that there is this whole story by the Melech Elyon, and we see a very similar pattern by the Maisa Elokeinu, so we need to do an investigation over here and see if you have the same outcome. It's very possibly they went through a similar process. This is not only true for Shachris, it's also true for Musaf. For Musaf, we also have a Maisa Elokeinu, again, Musaf of Yom Kippur. This also goes through all the Aleph Beis, and again, no letters are missing. It begins with the words Ader B'Viyudai, and then it has Berum of V'Sachasoidai, every single letter of the Aleph Beis. But at the end, we close the Aron, and again we say Maisa Enosh, the same two lines. The same two lines that we say by Shachris, we say over here, Shiftoi B'Soich Mirma, and then we go back to Maisa Elokeinu. Once we know what happened Rosh Hashanah with the Melech Elyon, and we see something very similar over here, we need to get suspicious. That invites us to open up manuscripts and look at this Maisa Elokeinu the way it looked in prior years. And when we look at manuscripts, we actually find, the first thing we find is very similar to what I showed you before with the Melech Elyon. There's Maisa Elokeinu without any Maisa Enosh. No talk of the human being at all. Just like with the Melech Elyon, I showed you that there was many manuscripts had no Melech Elyon. Here there's no Maisa Enosh. So this is starting to sound really similar to what we saw before with the Melech Elyon piyut. This is true for Musaf as well. I'm showing you now in two manuscripts Shachris, Michael 627 from the Bodleian Library, and the Bodleian Library Laud 321, no Maisa Enosh. And then we go to Michael 627 and we look at Musaf, again, 0 Maisa Enosh. So we continue digging. Let's look more, because all of a sudden now we're suspicious. And we're expecting to find, possibly, that there maybe was once upon a time a much more complete Maisa Enosh, which would make sense. Just like once upon a time, there was a piyut written about a king that is half about God and half about a human king. There is reason to believe that once upon a time there was a piyut that spoke about Maisa Elokeinu, and the other half spoke about Maisa Enosh. So we're looking here, Bavarian State Library, Codex Hebrew 69, and we find exactly that. This is dated to the late 13th, early 14th century. We're looking at Shachris of Yom Kippur, and we find the piyut Maisa Elokeinu. And under the whole piyut, meaning after the whole Maisa Elokeinu, after Aleph through Taf is complete, it says under it, without Nekudos, interestingly, Maisa Enosh, and it goes through the entire thing. And not only goes through the entire thing, we actually notice a pattern here, very interesting. Maisa Elokeinu goes from Aleph to Taf. And here, Maisa Enosh, talking about human beings, goes in the opposite direction, which is a very important point. What's the first word? So Maisa Enosh, human behavior. Now, what does the first word need to be? With a Taf. And indeed it is here. It's here with a Taf. Tachbuloisav mezima. His schemes are corrupt. And then it has a shin. And then it has a resh. Now, if you go to our Machzor, we actually don't have the word Tachbuloisav mezima. We have the word Vitachbuloisav. Because somehow it became Maisa Enosh Vitachbuloisav. But that can't be right. By definition, it can't be right because we have a tashrak here. The Maisa Enosh goes from Taf to Shin to Reish to Kuf. So we need the first letter to be a Taf. That Vav can't be there. How exactly the Vav was introduced and why is not entirely clear. I did check 16th century prints and the Vav was already there. So that requires an investigation to figure out how that Vav landed there. But on the face of it, it does seem like that's not supposed to be there. It's also interesting, the Maisa Elokeinu goes from Aleph to Taf. Maybe we can say that's about building, getting stronger. The Maisa Enosh goes from Taf to Aleph. Maybe that's about the human being becoming weaker and weaker. But the bottom line is, we're starting to see the same thing that we saw Rosh Hashanah for the Melech Elyon, we're seeing for Yom Kippur, for the Maisa Elokeinu, that there was a corresponding Maisa Enosh that was much fuller than what we say today. Okay. This is true for Shachris. And this is not only one manuscript. We look at Basel University manuscript, Roman 2, and we find exactly the same thing. Maisa Lekenus, followed by Maisa Enosh, and again, Tachbuloisav is the first word. When we want to look at Musaf, so now we're looking at Siddur Minig Roma. It's a manuscript from the 14th or 15th centuries. This is National Library of France 621, not the same one that we were talking about before. And here we do have Rabbi Lazar HaKolir's Musaf Maisa Elekenu Adir B'Viyudai, and it here, after all the Maisa Elekenus are finished, it then begins Maisa Enosh. But again, the Tuf is independent. Obviously, Rabbi Lazar HaKolir, he did his own. It doesn't have Tachbuloisav Mizima, which is what we say. It has Tacharus Rachamav. I'm not going to go and read the whole line, but it has over there its own independent Tuf. And then we continue and we look at additional manuscripts. Berlin, manuscript Oriental 4200. Here we find Maisa Lekenu with Maisa Enosh for the Kolir, for Rebbe Lazar HaKolir's Musaf of Yom Kippur, and here, rather than the Maisa Enosh coming after, and at the bottom, after we finished all the Maisa Lekenus, it's actually integrated. One line Maisa Lekenu, one line comparing Maisa Enosh. So the Maisa Lekenu gives us an Aleph, the Maisa Enosh gives us a Taf. The next Maisa Lekenu gives us a Beis, the Maisa Lekenu continues, gives us a Beis, and then the next Maisa Enosh gives us a Shin, etc., etc., integrated. And that's how it goes fully through. Which means that we can therefore summarize that the following story happened. Number one, Rabbi Lazar HaKolir, in his day, wrote a full Maisa Elekenu, Maisa Enosh piyut that was likely integrated. The Maisa Enosh was integrated with the Maisa Elekenu. A few centuries later, Reb Meshulam Bar Kloinomis in Mainz wrote a full Maisa Lekenu Maisa Enosh piyut to be recited in Shachris of Yom Kippur. This too presumably would have been integrated, going back between the Maisa Lekenu and the Maisa Enosh, based on the evidence that we've seen so far. Here too, there must have been a disruption. This disruption happened early on, because when we look at 13th, 14th century manuscripts, we see that there are some that have no Maisa Enosh whatsoever. Okay, so that's the most extreme form of the disruption, is having the complete removal of the Melech Evion stanzas, of the Maisa Enosh stanzas. We've also seen a different form of a disruption, delaying the Maisa Enosh stanzas to after completing the Maisa Lekenu, and again having them appear without nekudos and in a smaller font, indicating not everyone says this, and if you are going to say it, maybe say it in a quieter voice. And then what we've found, though I didn't show this in a manuscript, but what we have is the custom of retaining just one line, specifically the first line of the Maisa Enosh, the Taf, for both. And then very similar to what happened with the Melech Elyon, happened over here. That rather than allowing Reb Shimon to have his and Elazar HaKolir to have his, what happened over there is we use Reb Elazar HaKolir's for both, even though it does not such a great fit. Something very similar happened here. Rather than allowing Reb Meshulam to use his for his and Reb Elazar HaKolir's for his, we use Reb Meshulam's Maisa Enosh for both. Tachbuloisav Mezima. And we added the Vav in the beginning, which is problematic as we spoke about before. Okay, so that seems to have been the case. Now, why am I bringing all of this in? Why is it relevant to have all of this information about Yom Kippur's Maisa Elekenu? The reason is because now we need to ask ourselves. We came up with a whole theory, Rabbi Sachs and the Taimyamin Hagim and Reb Wolf Heidenheim, that what? It was dangerous because of the Malucha. You can't disparage the king when you're living in his dominion. Okay, that made a lot of sense when we were looking narrowly at that issue. But now we're dealing with a different piyut. A piyut that's similar in concept, comparing God's behavior to human behavior, but at no point here are we talking about a king. We're talking about all humans, Maisa Enosh, every single human. So anything that we're saying here about Maisa Enosh would not be offensive to a king. And yet, this material was lost. There was a disruption. It was removed. Why was this removed? So if we want to hold on to our prior theory, so now we're going to have to start bringing like band-aids to protect the earlier theory. The earlier theory was that it was unsafe and unsmart because it'd be offensive to the king. Okay, then why was Ma'aseh Enosh disturbed? So then we would have to say, well, once they were doing that, they felt that it's similar, and so because Melech Evyon was dangerous, they figured, especially when you're anxious, maybe you're not acting rationally, and so you say, let's take out Ma'aseh Enosh because that's a little similar. But I find that very difficult. I find that very difficult. Or maybe they would have said, well, maybe it's going to be interpreted that the Ma'aseh Enosh that we're talking about over here is not just any Enosh, but is the king, and so therefore they decided it's a good idea to remove this because it's not safe. I find that difficult as well. Why would a piyut that talks about Ma'aseh Enosh be construed as referring to a king? So, then maybe you could say, well, originally they removed the Melech Elyon, and then a few decades later someone came and said, well, if we remove the Melech Evyons, so then doesn't that mean we have to remove the Ma'aseh Enosh? And maybe the original understanding was confused, and so therefore they went ahead. I don't like that type of explanation. I think that's a very big doichak. So I think what this forces us to do is really go back to the drawing board and say we need a new theory that would account for both. That would account for why this happened to Ma'aseh Elikenu and Melech, why this happened to Ma'aseh Enosh and happened to Melech Evyon. So, for example, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not completely satisfied with either of these explanations. But maybe there is the idea that on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we should be focusing more on Hashem's greatness, Melech Elyon, Ma'aseh Elikenu, and less on man's limits, whether it's a king or whether a human being. Nothing to do with fear from the outside, just internally. There's so much to say on Yom Kippur. There's so much to recite on Rosh Hashanah. There are so many piyutim. Remember, this is the age when new piyutim are still being written. So there's almost like a contest to get more in. So why should we spend so much time reading so much lines about the lowliness of man when we can use that time to recite perhaps another beautiful piyut that was written perhaps someone we know in the shul? So maybe that would be a reason to say, let's get rid of this. It's not necessary. Now, the question on that is, why is it not necessary? Gadlus hakel v'shiflus adam. It is important to talk about shiflus adam. And in fact, there are many other places in the Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur davening where we do mention shiflus adam. So I'm not so satisfied by this explanation. But here's another possible explanation. And it's a little similar idea, but with a little tweak. And that is, why compare two incomparable things? The whole structure of these two piyutim is, which is really beautiful on the one hand, Melech Elyon, look how great Hashem is. Now let's compare it to Melech Evyon. Let's look at a human king, any human king. Ma'aseh Elikenu, look at God's deeds. Let's compare it to Ma'aseh Enosh. So it almost as if you're saying God's greatness is because it's relative to human frailties. But isn't it true that God's greatness is irrespective, even if humans were greater than they are and didn't have all the limitations that they have? Or let's say they were angels. Is it not true that God is even greater than the angels? In other words, why compare two things? It's almost as if you're limiting God's greatness when your starting point is that he's better than Ma'aseh Enosh, that he's better than Melech Evyon. So therefore, just talk about his greatness. That's something we're supposed to do without framing the conversation around human beings. Okay, that doesn't have the problems that I spoke about before, because I asked before, what's wrong with talking about shiflus adam? We do so. Okay, see here, there's nothing wrong with talking about shiflus adam, but don't use shiflus adam as the frame for regarding God as great. Okay, I understand. I hear the argument. I hear the theory, but I'm not absolutely convinced by this either. This is a reason to touch a piyut that was written by the great Rebbe Elazar HaKalir and the great Reb Shimon and the great Reb Meshulam. I find these difficult. And so therefore, I am going to conclude by saying I think this is a little bit of a mystery, but it's not only a mystery to me for Ma'aseh Elikenu. I'm rather convinced that it's the same reason that would have led to the tampering of both of these piyutim. But what's the takeaway from all of this? I think one key takeaway from all of this is that a lot of work, a lot of effort, and a lot of beauty is embedded in these piyutim. And when we spend the time on actually reading them and studying them and reading translations of them, we can pick up a lot of beautiful ideas and a lot of interesting things as well. And so therefore, I wish you all success in doing so. And you should have a ksiva v'achsima tova, l'shana tova, u'misukah.